Texas and Oklahoma are joining the SEC a year earlier than expected in 2024. So, what is scheduling going to look like for college football in this new look SEC as it expands? Well, we can tell you this. It's most likely going to be a divisionless SEC, which means you're probably going to see something a bit of a pod system, even though they won't necessarily call it that. What is that going to look like? Probably going to be a 9-game schedule instead of an 8-game conference schedule with a 3-6-6 format. That means 3 permanent rivals and 6 opponents that will rotate every year. So, what will that look like? Well, I've talked to people over the last couple of years about all of this, and this is kind of my idea of what the schedule should look like with the 3 permanent rivals for each team. So I'm going to go through it team by team and give you my quick thoughts on all of this. Again, this is my idea based off of 1, keeping some rivals on the schedule, maintaining historic rivalries, reigniting old rivalries, especially from those with Texas and OU and current members of the SEC, and then also competitive balance. What helps the top teams, but what also helps the bottom teams to potentially become bowl eligible in the near future as we move into this new look SEC. We start with Alabama. Alabama, my schedule idea, Auburn, Tennessee, and LSU as the 3 permanent rivals. This keeps that big time rivalry, obviously, with Iron Bowl, with Auburn. It keeps a rivalry with Tennessee, and also keeps that budding rivalry with LSU that's been going on for 20-plus years. Maybe not necessarily a trophy game, but keeps that going. Everybody's going to want to play Alabama. I know a lot of OU fans are actually expecting and petitioning in some instances to be able to play Alabama every single year. But at this point, I think this is kind of what we look at right now. Auburn, Tennessee, LSU. Arkansas, very interesting because they have not been able to really start up a rivalry since joining the SEC itself back in 1992. But yet they have trophy games against Texas A&M, LSU, the boot, and Mizzou for the Battle Line rivalry trophy. But none of those have really ever kind of come together and give you that oomph. But they're about to have it with old-time Southwest Conference rival Texas. This is a legit rivalry between the two schools. And whenever they've played against each other in non-conference games since 1992, it's been sellout crowds and amazing atmospheres. In fact, Arkansas beat Texas in 2021, and the fans rushed the field at Razorback Stadium. So, Arkansas's rivals, Texas, Mizzou, you keep that on there. And then let's go with Oklahoma. That's a border rivalry game and also a battle of 2 crimson or red teams, and a battle that could be very interesting and ignite some things. There's a lot of OU fans in the state of Arkansas, especially just south of Fayetteville in the Fort Smith area. And then also you got OU fans who are very familiar with Arkansas, and yet these teams have not really played all that often. I think that's a nice little mix there that could help both programs. And of course, remove that LSU game as a permanent rivalry. You say, well, that's a trophy game. You can't get rid of it. Well, we're not getting rid of it. It's just not going to be on the schedule every single year. And again, trophy games don't have to be rivalry games every year on the schedule. You see it with the Big Ten. Auburn. This is interesting because Auburn's had one of the top schedules in college football over the last 10 years because of their rivalry with Alabama and their rivalry with Georgia. And we know how great those teams have been. I think you keep those 2 on the schedule for Auburn. You have to. Those are very historic, especially the Iron Bowl and the Deep South Soldiers rivalry, of course. One that maybe you could argue should be played every other year, but the fans and I think the administrations there would not like that. And so to keep it, quote unquote, balanced for Auburn, I think you should add Vanderbilt as a permanent rival. Florida, Georgia, of course. You got to keep the world's largest outdoor cocktail party on the schedule. Tennessee, you got to keep that one on there. And then out South Carolina, I think a lot of people might argue for an LSU or maybe an Auburn, talking about A-man corner for Auburn and Florida way back in the early 90s when those teams would always play there near the end of the season. I don't think you really need to necessarily reignite that quote-unquote rivalry because you got to keep that competitive balance. I think adding South Carolina to that 3-team rotation would help. Kentucky. This is where we start talking about the bottom half of the conference and keeping it competitively balanced. Yes, Kentucky's won 10 games a couple of times under Mark Stoops, and it's amazing, but you got to keep the competitive level there balanced. I think you go with Ole Miss, which has become a really good game here in the last 10 years. Mizzou, which has been a really good rivalry that's been budding here for the last 5 years, in my opinion, if you keep close with it. And then Mississippi State, which Kentucky has been playing every year for quite a while, and that's become kind of an event in some instances for both Mississippi State fans and Kentucky when they kind of build their own calendars for their families. Mizzou, Arkansas, as I mentioned, Kentucky, as I mentioned, and then Mississippi State. Again, competitive balance and get things going there. Oklahoma, again, keep Texas. You have to. No, I mean, we're not going to get rid of that game. You got to play that game in Dallas every single year in the Red River rivalry, the Red River shootout. Arkansas, as I mentioned, and then I think you play Texas A&M. I know some people say maybe Mizzou to lighten up the schedule, but the way that sets up, a lot of people would argue take Arkansas off the schedule or maybe take Texas A&M off the schedule so you could put Alabama on there. That's what the OU fans want. That's what some of the administration want. But I think this is a nice little balance there. You're still going to get Alabama every once in a while anyway as a rotational opponent. South Carolina, Vanderbilt, Georgia, and Florida, as I mentioned earlier. You get the top two programs, arguably, in the quote-unquote SEC East, which is going to be gone the way of the dinosaurs here soon. And then you add Vanderbilt, which historically has actually been kind of an interesting game between those two programs. Tennessee, as we all know, Alabama, Florida, as we all know, and then Vanderbilt. Again, help with the competitive balance there is Tennessee is a program that's going to have a very tough schedule year in and year out anyway, with its main rivals in Florida and Alabama. Yes, no Georgia on that schedule. I think you keep Georgia away from Tennessee. Again, my idea. We'll see how it happens. You got to help protect all these programs as much as you can when it becomes about competitive balance. Texas, as I mentioned, reignite the rivalry with Texas A&M. We haven't played it in a decade. Get it back on the books every single year. I think both programs want it, even if they might say, hey, we don't, or whatever publicly, and there's some hemming and hawing and political things going on in the background. These teams will end up playing, if for no other reason than it's great television, it's great money influx, and ESPN and the SEC want that. It has to be played every year. Texas A&M has to be an on-campus game. They play Oklahoma as well, and Arkansas, again, a great Southwest Conference rivalry, reignited. These teams have some classic battles through the years in the Southwest Conference, and there's even some great battles in non-conference seasons in this decade and the last 2 decades. That is a great rivalry, one of the best ones we had back in the 20th century. Texas A&M, Texas, got to play them every year, on-campus game. LSU, that has become a fantastic rivalry game here in just a short period of time between the Aggies and the Tigers, battling there on I-10, as we've seen the great classic games, overtime games. This is a game that needs to stay on the schedule. And so instead of like an LSU maybe going to an Auburn or something like that, or even a Florida, I think you match it up with Texas A&M. Again, the pod idea, keeping it regional, that's a great rivalry that's been happening the last few years. And then Oklahoma, again, strike that balance with all the old Big 12 teams getting together and keeps it regionalized. We got to keep this game regionalized as much as possible, even as this game becomes more national across college football. Then Vanderbilt. Let's not forget about Vanderbilt. I think they got a semi-tough schedule anyway with what I'm about to lay out, but I still think this gives them an opportunity to break through and maybe get to a bowl game every now and again, which obviously has been next to impossible the last decade plus since James Franklin left for Penn State. But with Vanderbilt, you give them Tennessee for the in-state rivalry game, which it's not a big deal, but it is to the players and to the fan base, especially there in Nashville. South Carolina, which again, there's been some good matchups there. Again, keeping it regional. And then Auburn, as I mentioned, because Auburn needs a little bit of a break with its incredible schedule against Alabama and Georgia, arguably the 2 best programs in the entire nation, already as permanent rivals. So those are my ideas for the rotation. Again, the SEC has not approved anything yet. Heck, they might stick with 8 games and do a different type of rotation there with 1 or 2 permanent rivals. But as it stands right now, from my sourcing, it looks like they're going to a 9-game conference schedule starting in 2024 without divisions with 3 permanent rivals. This is my ideas. What are yours? Share it down below in the comments section. And of course, make sure to like and subscribe to this channel for much more intel across the college football landscape.